Welcome to another deep dive into the pages of history. Today we will explore a grim yet significant chapter of World War II, the Bataan Death March. In early 1942, amid the turmoil of the Pacific War, the Battle of Bataan unfolded on a narrow peninsula in the Philippines. As the Allies faced defeat against the Japanese forces, approximately 76,000 Filipino and American troops were captured. This marked the beginning of a horrific journey known as the Bataan Death March, an event that stands out for its brutality and the endurance of the human spirit. Over 60 miles, these prisoners of war were forced to march under grueling conditions, with scarce food and water, enduring physical abuse and witnessing horrific atrocities committed by their captors. The death toll was staggering, as thousands perished on this harrowing journey, marking it as one of the most infamous war crimes of the 20th century. The Bataan Death March is not just an account of war, but a testament to the resilience of those who survived it. It reminds us of the worst and best of humanity, revealing the dark depths of cruelty and the indomitable spirit of survival. Join us as we recount this significant historical event and honour the memory of those who lived and died during the march. The world was at war in the early 1940s. World War II, sparked by the expansionist policies of Germany, Italy and Japan, had quickly engulfed the globe. The conflict in the Pacific was triggered by Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The United States and its allies responded with a formal declaration of war, marking the beginning of a grim and challenging conflict that would stretch across the vast Pacific Ocean. The Japanese military was strategic and aggressive, quickly advancing across the Pacific. Their strategy was to secure the raw materials needed for their wartime economy and to create a defensive perimeter to protect their hard-won gains. This involved swiftly taking over territories including Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, and shortly after, the Philippines. The Philippines, a commonwealth of the United States at the time, was a key strategic location in the Pacific theatre. It was a home to a sizable contingent of American and Filipino forces. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, these troops were tasked with defending the Philippines against potential Japanese attacks. However, they faced numerous challenges. Despite their courage and determination, the defenders were significantly outnumbered, lacked adequate air support, and were dealing with issues of supplies and resources. The situation was compounded by the fact that the Philippines was the first line of defense, and that reinforcement and resupply were nearly impossible due to the ferocity of the Japanese offensive. Despite these odds, they held out for over 3 months against the Japanese onslaught, creating a significant delay in Japan's timetable for conquest. However, defeat was ultimately inevitable, leading to the events of the Bataan Death March. In the wake of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japan moved swiftly to extend its empire through Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Philippines, as an American territory, became a prime target. Despite a valiant defense led by General Douglas MacArthur, Filipino and American forces were steadily overwhelmed. The Battle of Bataan, which lasted from January to April 1942, was a pivotal event during this time. Bataan, a strategic peninsula, became the last stronghold of resistance after the fall of Manila. The defenders, despite facing resource shortages, disease, and the constant threat of Japanese attacks, fought relentlessly for over 3 months. However, the Japanese assault was unyielding. After the final offensive in early April 1942, with the troops weakened by malnutrition and diseases like malaria and beriberi, it was clear that the situation was unsustainable. As the situation grew increasingly desperate, the decision to surrender became inevitable. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward P. King Jr., who had assumed command after MacArthur was ordered to Australia, made the heartbreaking decision to capitulate. Without communication with higher command, King took the initiative to prevent further loss of life. King met with the Japanese command and offered the surrender of the entire Bataan force, approximately 76,000 Filipino and American troops. This marked the largest ever surrender of US military personnel in history. Despite King's plea for humane treatment of his men, the Japanese, unprepared for such a large number of prisoners, ignored these terms. The surrender set the stage for what would become known as the Bataan Death March, one of the most infamous war crimes of World War II. Following the surrender, the Japanese were suddenly responsible for an estimated 76,000 prisoners of war, a number far exceeding their expectations. There was no plan in place for transporting this vast number of captives. Thus, a hasty decision was made. The prisoners would march from Bataan to a railway station at San Fernando, a distance of approximately 65 miles. On April 10, 1942, the march commenced. The captives were grouped and lined up in columns at Mariveles, the southernmost point of the Bataan Peninsula. Despite their exhaustion and malnourishment, they were compelled to start walking. Each group was escorted by Japanese soldiers, whose treatment of their captives was harsh and merciless. The marching prisoners had little to no access to food and water, and any attempt to fall out was met with severe punishments, or even death. The conditions of the march were beyond inhumane. The tropical heat, coupled with almost non-existent food and water supplies, made the journey a living hell. The men suffered from dehydration, exhaustion, and disease, while the punishing pace and lack of rest further exacerbated their suffering. The mental conditions were equally brutal. Soldiers were frequently subjected to random and often brutal acts of violence from their captors, including beatings, stabbings, and beheadings. Those who could not keep up with the pace were either left behind to die or summarily executed. The sight of their comrades suffering and dying was a constant psychological torment. The horror of the march was not only the physical deprivation but also the cruel, arbitrary violence and psychological torture. The march became a grim testament to the human capacity for endurance in the face of unimaginable hardship and cruelty. The Bataan Death March was a catalogue of unspeakable atrocities that defied the standards of warfare and humanity. The Japanese captors treated their prisoners with shocking cruelty. Starvation and dehydration were rampant due to the lack of food and water. Prisoners who requested, or were even perceived to be seeking water or food, were often subjected to ruthless beatings or execution. The captors seemed to show a particular penchant for random, brutal violence. Soldiers who fell behind, either from weakness or injury, were routinely executed in horrific ways, bayoneted, shot, or even beheaded. Some prisoners were used for target practice, or were forced to dig their own graves before being buried alive. Additionally, there were numerous instances of torture and humiliation. The sun treatment was one such case where prisoners were made to sit in the tropical sun without any shade for hours. The immediate effect of those atrocities was devastating. It's estimated that between 5,000 to 18,000 Filipino soldiers and 500 to 650 American soldiers died during the march. Those who survived were severely weakened, both physically and mentally, making them more susceptible to further abuse and the harsh conditions at the prisoner of war camps to which they were later sent. The long-term effects were equally profound. Survivors carried the physical and psychological scars of their experiences for the rest of their lives. Many were left with chronic physical ailments as a result of malnutrition, abuse, and disease. Psychologically, the survivors faced PTSD, depression, and other mental health issues due to the immense trauma they had endured. Moreover, the experience of the Bataan Death March had broader cultural and societal impacts. The stories of the survivors served to expose the realities of war crimes, helping to shape post-war tribunals and the creation of more robust international laws around the treatment of prisoners of war. It also galvanized the Allied forces' determination to defeat the Axis powers, making the event a dark but significant turning point in the Pacific War. The immediate aftermath of the Bataan Death March was a continuation of the nightmare for the survivors. On reaching San Fernando, the exhausted prisoners were crammed into boxcars and transported to CampO'Donnel, an unfinished Filipino training base the Japanese utilized as a prisoner of war camp. The conditions here were hardly better than the march. Overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, lack of food and medical supplies led to high mortality rates, with thousands more dying in the weeks following their arrival. News of the atrocities committed during the march began to filter out to the international community, causing outrage and strengthening Allied resolve. Simultaneously, the Japanese used the march as a show of power, intended to demoralize the Allied forces and their supporters. The long-term impact of the Bataan Death March was profound, both on a personal and international level. For the survivors and their families, the aftermath was a lifelong struggle with physical injuries, psychological trauma, and the painful memories of their ordeal. The experience bound them together in a fraternity of shared suffering and resilience. On a broader scale, the march was a catalyst for change in the conduct of war. The revelation of the Japanese army's war crimes led to increased scrutiny and calls for justice, culminating in the post-war Tokyo trials. These trials helped establish a precedent for international justice and the treatment of war criminals, contributing to the development of the Geneva Convention rules regarding prisoners of war. Moreover, the march and its aftermath had a deep effect on Filipino national consciousness. They shared suffering during the march, and the subsequent occupation played a role in fostering unity and resistance against foreign oppression, contributing to the country's post-war recovery and shaping of its modern identity. The Bataan Death March remains a chilling testament to the harsh realities of war, underscoring the depths of human cruelty and resilience. Remembering such events is essential to honour the victims, learn from history, and work towards a world where such atrocities are a thing of the past. If you found this video informative and want to learn more about such pivotal moments in history, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We would appreciate your comments and any questions you might have, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. Thank you for watching, and let's continue exploring these profound stories from our past together.